You've been dispatched to only God knows where, and are now floating on a boat in the middle of some ocean. It's night, and the boat is poorly lit. You're days from the nearest landmass, let alone the nearest hospital. The patient before you is covered with burns to their head and neck and torso and arms. His face is so swollen, he's no longer recognizable. His breathing does not come easy, and with every inspiration, you hear that loud wheeze of Strider. You know you're going to have to secure the airway, and that it's not going to be an easy intubation. You are a part of a small team, and your only backup is a satellite phone. And this isn't the only patient with critical burns you have on this boat. This is an actual rescue mission the U.S. Air Force Pararescue Jumpers, PJs, performed. A team of PJs responded to a cold freighter in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean. The freighter had experienced an explosion on board, and multiple crew members were burned. They arrived to find 2 crew members with full thickness burns to the head, neck, torso, and arms. Does this scenario feel like a familiar call to you? Probably not. I mean, sure, the burns may be familiar to a patient we've run before, or at the very least prepared for, but the environment, isolated on a boat, having got there by jumping out of a plane with all your gear, very limited by the resources you brought with you, hours, maybe even days away from definitive care, this is not the environment most of us work in. However, although most of us are not flying into the middle of an ocean to deal with patients in incredibly austere environments, there are still so many lessons we can learn from this unbelievably challenging real-world rescue. Dr. Michael Lauria studied this case and identified 10 lessons that were directly tied to the outcome of the rescue mission. And these are lessons we can all take to our own clinical practice. Don't worry, at the end of the episode, I'll fill you in on the ultimate outcome of this incredibly heroic mission. But first, I want you to hear Dr. Lauria's 10 lessons learned from reviewing this mission.
Here you on 8. You on 8. Okay, you're clear. Stand by for your base.
Welcome to EMS Cast, where we provide high-level education for you, the providers on the streets. Today's episode is brought to you by Frontline Optics. We know the pre-hospital environment is tough on your sunglasses, but that shouldn't mean wearing subpar, cheap sunglasses because you're afraid you're going to break them at work. That's why Frontline Optics created sunglasses specifically for you, the providers on the streets. These sunglasses are not only stylish and affordable, but they're designed tough, rated for safety. And if you do ever scratch, break, or lose your sunglasses, they have a no questions asked replacement policy. Did I also mention that a portion of each purchase goes to a first responders children's charity? Go to frontlineoptics.com and use the discount code EMSCast15 to get yourself 15% off some sweet shades. That's EMSCast15. Please support us by supporting those who help make this show possible. And we actually really believe in this company. Both Will and I own a pair and love them. So go get yourself a pair. You will not be disappointed. Today's episode is with Dr. Michael Lauria. More on him in a second, but first a disclaimer. This was recorded on site in a big conference hall, and the audio is not of our normal studio quality. But do not let that detract, because this was one of the best lectures I heard at the whole conference. Dr. Lauria does not disappoint. I want you to heed special attention to the last lesson. It is something we cannot forget: the importance of what we do and why we do it. No matter who you are or where you work, these lessons apply. Hear them, learn them, and implement them, because they are necessary steps in becoming a specialist in the field of pre-hospital medicine. Welcome to EMS Cast, where we provide high-level education for you, the providers on the streets. We are still on site here at the FAST 24 conference with FlightBridge, and just listened to an amazing talk by Dr. Michael Lauria, who is the medical director for FlightBridge and was a former PJ before going to medical school and doing an EMS fellowship, and is now finishing a critical care fellowship because he embodies the never stop learning mentality. So Mike, thanks for joining us on the podcast. We really appreciate it.
No problem. Pleasure to be here, man. Thank you so much for having me, Ross.
Yeah. And you just gave an amazing talk, and the talk focused on providing critical care in very austere environments. And you went through an actual PJ case, a pretty phenomenal, amazing case where they had to do some very critical care medicine in the middle of the ocean on a boat with limited resources. And it's amazing. And really you talked about 10 different lessons that I kind of want to go through with regards to what you can take away from that case to your own clinical practice. And the first of those was always be prepared, which sounds intuitive, but what does that mean?
Yeah. So like you said, it sounds totally intuitive. And I think for any EMS provider, any flight crew, like you go to work, you expect to go on calls, right? You're there essentially to do that. But I think what this point really taught me was it's more than just like being there and knowing that you have to go. Like it's being mentally and psychologically prepared to, you go from like eating your omelet at the breakfast table at the firehouse to like responding to a code or a bad car crash or whatever. Being like continually ready and prepared to just flip that switch into go mode is really important. And I think from my side too, I think one of the things we learned was that even from like an equipment deployment standpoint, and I feel like military and paramilitary organizations like the fire department, for example, are pretty good about this, mainly because the design and layout of the equipment is your life is essentially dependent on it. In medicine and even EMS, sometimes not so much. The design of how the equipment is laid out, how the airway stuff is laid out, how your surgical kit is laid out, how whatever is laid out, the ergonomics and design of that stuff is really important too. And I think subtle things like that are sometimes taken for granted and may not always be prepared as we think we are, or perhaps we should be.
Yeah, I agree. How do you psychologically, mentally prepare yourself, especially when you're walking into a shift where you're kind of dragging that day, you haven't gotten a lot of sleep?
Yeah. So these days it's a lot of caffeine starting. I think the other thing is you continually find your mind drifting to other stuff, like stuff at home, your mortgage, your lease, your family stuff, but intermittently and sporadically throughout the day, continually regrounding yourself and being like, okay, well, all right, we took care of that. Now I had to focus and be ready because at any second we get called to whatever, and continually like regrounding and re-preparing your mind for that. And the other piece of it is developing the psychological skills like an athlete to be able to go from like essentially a mode of like calm rest and preparation to flipping that switch really quickly and being able to move with a purpose and get to the aircraft or get to the truck and get out there and process the information from dispatch that's available and prepare yourself to deal with potentially a really serious situation.
Yeah. And I think you brought up a really good point about if all of that preparation has been done ahead of time with being thoughtful about where your equipment is, how it's laid out, how you're going to access it. That takes that mental energy off of, being prepared for receiving dispatch information, thinking critically about the call, which moves to your next point, which was economy of motion.
Yeah. So I think a common pithy saying in the fire service and EMS and even the military, although no one really knows where it seems to come from, is the whole slow is smooth and smooth is fast thing, which is true to an extent. But really, ultimately, what we're really getting at is not that we want people to always go slow. Like if you're in a RIT team going in to get a firefighter who's down, you're not going slow. You're being careful, but you're not going slow. The point of that saying is not to rush so you overstep things, miss things, and get yourself jacked up, injured, or hurt your patient, right? And the point is economy of motion, which is moving with a purpose and developing the skills so that they're developing various technical skills and other skill sets so you can do them quickly and efficiently with essentially minimal cognitive load.
Yeah, accomplishing that smoothness. And one of the examples you brought up was, practice and doing the same basic thing over and over again until it becomes breathing.
Yeah, it's I think very, very, very underestimated. And developing the psychomotor automaticity, or the muscle memory, if you will, to do even the most basic, benign, mundane skills like jaw thrusting and getting like a really good seal on a BVM are highly underrated. But doing them so that in the moment you don't really have to think about it, doing them so it's just natural is, in fact, really important, right? And so coming up with ways to develop those skills that they are automatic in a sense is absolutely super important.
Yeah, and it's something that we do once and we're like, oh yeah, this is easy, I got this. But when you read about any sort of expert in their field, like I remember a story of Kobe Bryant just practicing the most basic dribbling drills in practice as a professional athlete, as one of the best in his field. And he got that way by doing the basics continually so that it was just smooth and came naturally.
Yep, 100%.
And the third point you brought up was the dynamic and relative nature of safety.
Yeah, so more and more I'm becoming what a couple of us have termed in the past the safety anarchist. Safety is super, super important. I'm not saying we shouldn't be safe, but sometimes we overdo it a little bit. And I gave him the talk a ridiculous example. So like in theater, we're like in Iraq. It's like 2008, 2009. We're like getting mortared like on some of these bases. And in the infinite wisdom of the Air Force and the Army, they made rules about people wearing reflective belts and equipment over, mind you, their BDUs and camo, which is like insane. Right? It's safety to the nth degree where it becomes unsafe and or you can't accomplish the mission. I think we have to be very careful about how we think about it, and it's not always making rules and policies to the lowest common denominator. It's about thinking about safety in a dynamic and pragmatic way so that it keeps people alive and healthy, which is the goal, but allows us to do the mission safely and effectively.
Yeah, and you brought up that risk equation too.
Yeah, this was introduced to me from the technical rescue community, actually. And the equation being risk is essentially a function of the probability that something is going to happen times the consequence, right? So if it's, you're going to die, so a fatality would be a very extreme consequence. And that's divided by essentially your ability to mitigate that risk with technology, safety equipment, ropes, safety features on an ambulance or aircraft, and training. So your ability to prepare for a situation and make it so it's just so common and so rote that you've practiced it a billion times. Things that are relatively dangerous can become safe and reasonable.
Yeah. And once you've done that equation and decided to do something, point number 4 is 100% commit.
Yeah. And this one I think is really, really important. They're all important, but this one I really, really love because committing in your mind that this is my patient, I'm going to take care of them, I think is particularly important in EMS, because I remember being on the ground as a paramedic and sometimes things are so frustrating or so stressful that you're like, I just want to get them to the hospital. Like once I get them to the hospital, we'll hand them off and we'll be done, like hot potato style, right? Which changes someone's psyche in terms of the way they make decisions, the way they make operational and clinical decisions that may not be great. Determining commitment and having 100% commitment to a patient and ownership of every procedure, every medication, the documentation afterward, everything is super important because it changes that mindset. And I think with that commitment, what we'll see is the performance mindset and the operational skills that are executed are very, very different. And in my opinion, I cannot prove this, probably more beneficial to patients.
Yeah. And number 5 speaks to my heart a lot. I harp on this a lot on the podcast, but that's prepare for challenges and have tools to deal with the challenges that might arise.
Yeah. We work in probably one of the most complex, dynamic environments on the planet in terms of medicine, right? Out of the hospital where things change on a dime. I know in your neck of the woods, in my neck of the woods too, a lot of these calls are in places that don't have like the getting to them with an ambulance is like half the gig, right? Then you're like hiking on a trail or climbing over a ridgeline or all sorts of backcountry and austere environmental access, right? And understanding that those will present very unique challenges, even like the cool, sexy stuff like air rescue will present unique challenges, and just preparing yourself, right? Managing people's expectations is probably managing your own expectations. In this case, is probably one of the best things you can do. In fact, that's been studied. And so they've looked at people who are presented with very challenging situations versus those people that are presented with the same challenging situations, but they were prepared. They didn't weren't given the situation, but they're like, this is going to be really tough. You're going to run into stuff that's very challenging and you've never seen before. And it may make you want to quit, or it may make you want to stop, or it may make you want to give up. Despite the fact that those test subjects and these experiments have very similar backgrounds and training, the ones that were at least prepared psychologically for the inevitable challenge did much better. They were quicker at solving problems. They were more likely to complete the task. And the same thing goes for us. Just accepting that even though it sounds like a bread and butter chest pain call or whatever, like committing to yourself and the patient essentially, that's like, all right, like it sounds like it's pretty bread and butter, but we may run into problems. They may develop, ventricular arrhythmias. We may come up against challenges they've never seen before, and that's okay. Like we'll come up with a way to address it.
Yeah, that's great. I think point number 6 is going to speak to every one of our listeners, and that's the asymmetrical clinical care, or the power of a small team.
Yeah, this one I love because it really, really resonates with a lot of EMS crews. Like how many times have we been, like as pre-hospital physicians or like our paramedics or EMS crews out there, you run a code in someone's house or in business or in someone's business or in the field, anywhere, in the back of the ambulance. And yeah, it's a little chaotic sometimes, but you can run it with like 4, 6 people pretty well, right? It's pretty smooth. You know exactly where all the equipment is. You know exactly what your guidelines and protocols are. There's very clear communication, and it's like smooth sailing, man. How many of you guys have been into like an emergency department and there's way more people either on the floor or in the ED or in the ICU? There's like 30 people and it is a total goat rodeo.
Yeah. And somehow nothing's getting done.
Exactly. Like lots of movement, lots of screaming, lots of talking without a lot of goal directed behavior. And that's really important because I think what it tells us is even though under tremendous adversity, when it seems like there are big problems, a small team can often be a more effective team.
Yeah. Point number 7 is keep your clinical blade sharp.
Yeah. I think a lot of times it's especially, I see this with nurses. I see it with doctors. You see it with paramedics. I see it myself sometimes, and I try to be very careful about this. You hit like some level, like you pass a test, you pass an exam, you get to be a fellow, you get to be an attending, whatever. And then there's this plateau where you feel like you've hit all the marks and checked all the boxes. And a lot of people take that as an opportunity to kind of relax, chill out, and you should to a certain extent, but they let their blade get dull. Because it's very easy in any EMS system, emergency department or ICU, you get a lot of bread and butter stuff. You're not challenged. You're not pushed. Things become rote and mundane, and that can be dangerous because there's going to be that one call out of 100 where you can actually make a difference, but it's really, really challenging and hard. So keeping that blade sharp, continually challenging yourself, learning new stuff. Your brain is plastic, right? We've definitely learned that. And so continually learning new information, going to conferences, going to courses, attending lectures, reading articles, doing all sorts of stuff to expand your knowledge and keeping your skills sharp is absolutely critical.
Yeah, embodying that lifelong continual learning.
Exactly.
Number 8, logistics.
Oh man, logistics. It's so important. And again, preaching to a pre-hospital crowd, it's kind of preaching to the choir because we get that in terms of whether it's like you're in the fire department, you're used to doing calculations for like how much water you need for a fire or what you're able to provide in terms of water supply. And often, though, we are less, especially in some systems, less focused on some of the issues like oxygen. You got plenty of oxygen in the ambulance or with you, but especially in critical care transport, when you're working with long transports, sick patients, and in very rural or austere environments, and even our colleagues on the ground, right? You're moving someone in my neck of the woods from Gallup to Albuquerque, and they're on BiPAP or non-invasive by ground. That's a couple hours, and if they've got a leak, like you got to be pretty well assured you have enough oxygen to get from point A to point B. You have enough medications. You have enough like supplies to do whatever is super, super important. And we sometimes take that for granted. And in an austere environment, you can't.
Yeah. And sometimes things go awry, just like we were talking about preparing for those challenges, preparing for those things that may go wrong. And sometimes you have to, improvise, adapt, and overcome, which is number 9. But I love how you preface this and that you improvise upon a foundation of principles.
Yeah, this came to mind because it's sort of like often in the career field, and by that I mean the pararescue career field, you're kind of considered like a jack of all trades, and we pride ourselves on coming up with creative solutions to problems, which is good, right, under some situations. But we've seen for sure in medicine how like some of the improvised and slapped together tools that we thought might be helpful, and I always use the example of like those plastic like airway boxes and stuff during COVID. Some of these ridiculous things turned out to not only be ineffective, but potentially harmful. And so you really got to think about if it's appropriate to do it. And then if you do it, trying your very best to build on a foundation of like what is acceptable and what the standard of care or the standard way of doing things is. And then lastly, I still tell people, and if I'm going to do something crazy and wazoo and like slap together or improvise, I will still get like multiple people on board. So if I'm at an outside hospital, for example, and be like, I will talk to the sending physician. And even I now will like call the receiving ICU attending and being like, I can't quite do X, but I think I can get away with Y. That might be a reasonable clinical intervention that will achieve the goal with perhaps minimal evidence behind it. Are you okay with this? And oftentimes, if you don't have other options, people will say, okay, but at least you've gotten everybody on board and you've thought about it before slapping together some duct tape and other, EMS paraphernalia to build something that may not be super effective.
Yeah. Well, to wrap it up, point number 10, I think is so important for a long, fulfilling career. And that is just remember who you're fighting for.
Yeah, this one I think, and I'm sure you can appreciate this during like the long dark days of residency when like you're working like 70 or 80 hours a week, or you've been in EMS for like 7 or 10 years and you're just slogging away with shift after shift. It's really hard sometimes, man. You get really burned out and really tired and you just want to stop. And a lot of people second guess their the reason why they came into EMS or why they became a nurse or a doctor. And that's really hard. And I think one of the lessons that I learned, that I took away, that I really try to do, and granted, sometimes I fail, especially in the emergency department, is trying to remember who you're fighting for, and trying to remember that these patients are coming in. Man, they can be very not nice people, and they can be pretty grouchy, and even violent, but they're people. They have families. They weren't always this way. We're seeing them on the worst day of their life, probably. And remembering that, and remembering that why we're doing this in the first place is to help these people and help them get back to their families. Even if it's not that every patient, keeping that in mind, so that when that one truly innocent, poor individual that's coming in with a STEMI or a stroke or was in a really bad car accident, you are going through that resuscitation, you're moving through that transport, and you are motivated internally to be at your very, very best because of who you're fighting for. You're trying to save this person who's a daughter or a son or a wife or a husband. And that, I think, is really important.
Yeah. And recognizing that person has someone too, and treating them as if they were your own family member, as we often talk about.
Yeah, 100%.
Finally, you wrapped up the talk with a very motivational, do hard things.
Yeah. I was recently reading a couple articles about, they're human factors articles on challenges in engineering in NASA. And I re-stumbled across JFK's talk in 1962, where he justified to the American people, and he was heavily criticized. The entire space program was heavily criticized for spending unimaginable amounts of money. And he justified it to them in a very eloquent way, but he ended it with a very emotive, or it was actually in the middle of the speech, he gave this very emotive several lines on, why do we do these things? Well, we choose to go to the moon and do these other things, not because they're easy, but because they're hard. And that it is doing it because it's hard and it's challenging and it pushes us. But what I always try to tell people is doing the hard thing is really, really good for a number of reasons, and often for unrecognized reasons. So let's say, and I've had people come up to me, even at this conference, be like, I studied so hard for the FPC exam, or I studied so hard for this to pass national registry at some point, and I failed. And I felt like all that work was for nothing, right? I did something hard and I got nothing out of it. Well, if you think about it, you did. And the same thing is true of the space program, right? They failed quite a few times, but in the interim, they developed satellite technology and all these other things, medical technologies that we just take for granted, but they were byproducts of a really hard effort. So maybe you fall short. Maybe you fail the test. Maybe you don't actually get approval from the hospital to get a new aircraft, or maybe the fire department says, no, we're not going to buy that new video laryngoscope. But in researching and in the motivated, directed effort to do those hard things, even if you don't get the outcome you wanted, there will be benefit.
Yeah, our greatest growths come from our failures.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. Thanks for coming on and sharing it with our listeners.
Oh, no problem, man. No problem. Take care.
There you have it. 10 lessons that directly impacted the outcome of the incredibly heroic mission performed by the United States Air Force PJs. Before I get to the outcome of this case, let me just recap these 10 lessons. 1, be prepared mentally and with where your equipment is and how it's laid out. 2, economy of movement. Move with purpose. Practice your skills. Practice your micro skills until your movement with each of these becomes second nature, decreasing your cognitive load on these critical calls. Number 3, the dynamic and relative nature of safety. The risk equation we should all be aware of is risk equals the probability of an event occurring times the consequence of said event divided by your ability to mitigate such an event. Number 4, 100% commit. Change your mind from, I just need to get this patient to the hospital, and 100% commit to their care. Take extreme ownership of every aspect of that care and realize that what you do pre-hospitally does have an effect on patient outcomes and does have an effect on our ability in the emergency department to streamline care and efficiently pick up where you left off. Number 5, prepare for challenges. We work in one of the most complex and dynamic environments. So manage your own expectations. Accept that running into problems is inevitable in this job, that calls are going to be challenging, and you're going to have to problem solve. Cognitively realizing this ahead of time has actually been proven to help individuals respond more effectively in these situations. Number 6, the power of a small team. A small team can often be more effective than a large team. Your small pre-hospital team is not necessarily a hindrance. It may actually be a benefit. Number 7, keep your clinical blade sharp. Keep learning, keep seeking continuous improvement and continued education like this podcast and others, and by simulating and practicing for your whole career. Keep learning. Number 8, logistics. Think about what you need ahead of time based on your location and your transport time. Number 9, improvise, adapt, and overcome. With limited resources, we often have to adapt and improvise. But anytime we do, be thoughtful about the benefit versus the harm of the proposed solution and get more people on board. Confirm the plan and expected benefit risk ratio with your teammates on scene. Call medical control and discuss the plan with them. See if they have any other ideas you haven't thought of. Number 10, remember who you're fighting for. You're here to help people, and not everyone is going to be nice, but you're still here to help. Remember, we are seeing them on one of the worst days of their lives, and they likely weren't always this way. And they likely have families that love them and care for them too. And then at the very end, he gave us a bonus lesson. Do hard things. There are a lot of unrealized positives to doing hard things. Even if you don't get the outcome you wanted, there will still be benefits. Our greatest growths come from our failures. So the outcome of the case, like I said, a team of PJs were dispatched to a cold freighter in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean. The freighter had experienced an explosion on board with multiple crew members burned. When they arrived, they found 2 crew members with full thickness burns to the head, neck, torso, and arms. Due to the injuries and swelling, both of these patients required advanced maneuvers to secure their airways. One was ultimately able to be intubated from above, but the other required a cricothyrotomy. They cared for both patients on ventilators for nearly 48 hours. At one point, one of the patients lost pulses to an extremity and required fasciotomies to decrease the pressure in the muscle compartments and restore perfusion. Eventually, a team from Portugal was able to come airlift the patients off the boat and take them to a burn center in Portugal, where after months of care, miraculously, both had good outcomes. There was, of course, lots and lots of care provided during this time, including plastic surgery and physical therapy, but ultimately both lived and kept all of their extremities. This was an incredibly challenging scenario with an amazing outcome. It highlights who and what we are all fighting for. To have the expertise and knowledge so that the patient in front of us has a shot at a good outcome. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. If you enjoy the show, subscribe and follow us on Instagram. And more importantly, tell a friend and leave us a 5-star review. It really does help us. And we can't do this without you, our listeners. Finally, support our sponsor, Frontline Optics, by grabbing yourself a pair of sunglasses with the discount code EMSCast15. Their financial support is responsible for us being able to put out consistent monthly content for you, and we need your help in validating that support for us. Plus, you get a sweet pair of sunglasses that are backed by a no questions asked replacement program. Until next time, keep sharpening that clinical blade because what you do matters.